The road out of Jerusalem didn't end at the city gate. It continued, past the last houses, past the last sounds of the market, until it reached a different kind of place entirely. A place where the rock stopped being used for walls and started being used for tombs. In first century Judea, the dead were never buried inside the city. Jewish law, deeply embedded in the Torah, considered a corpse ritually impure. To bury the dead within the city walls would have meant contaminating everything: the homes, the temple, the daily life of thousands. So the cemeteries lived on the outside, on the rocky hillsides, in the silence. If you had walked those roads around 30 CE, under Roman occupation, in the shadow of Herod's rebuilt temple, you would have passed these burial grounds without ceremony. Low stone entrances, carved into the hillside, sealed with heavy round stones, or sometimes flat slabs of rock. No gates, no fences, just limestone and silence, and the faint smell of dry desert air carried in on the eastern wind. And yet, this silence was never empty. It was full of something the living carried with them every time they passed. The moment of death. Death in first century Judea moved fast, not because the people were cold, but because the climate demanded it. In Jerusalem's heat, a body could not wait. Jewish law was clear. Burial had to happen quickly, almost always before sundown on the same day, or at the very latest by the following evening. The moment someone died, the household transformed. Women, usually the closest female relatives, would begin washing the body immediately. Men would go to find what was needed: linen cloth, burial spices, someone who knew the rituals. The community gathered without being asked. Neighbors appeared at the door carrying food, water, cloth. Professional mourners, women trained in the art of lamentation, were sometimes hired, even by families of modest means. Their voices, trained to a specific kind of wailing, would move through the narrow streets, announcing what had happened before any word was spoken aloud. There was no embalming, no refrigeration, no long wake with candles and flowers. Death had a smell, and the smell moved the living into urgent, deliberate action. The grief was real, but so was the urgency, because the body had to be ready before the sun moved too far across the sky. The preparation of the body. The preparation of the body was one of the most intimate acts a family could perform. It was done by hand, done with care, and done in a way that had been passed down through generations without ever being written in a single instruction. First, the body was washed. This was a ritual act, not merely a hygienic one. Water was poured slowly over the hands, the feet, the face. Then came the anointing: myrrh, aloes, sometimes crushed nard, mixed into a paste and applied between the folds of tightly wrapped linen cloth. The Gospels record this world with quiet precision. When Jesus was laid in the tomb, Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes. The text names the amount, nearly 100 pounds, an extraordinary quantity. The burial of a wealthy man, or at least the burial of a man whose followers wanted to honor him as one. The linen was wound around the entire body: arms, legs, torso. A separate cloth was folded over the face. The hands were placed deliberately. Each movement had weight. This was the last physical act of love a family could offer. The last touch, the last fold, the last moment when the body still belonged to the living, and then it was carried out into the light. The walk to the tomb. When the body was ready, the procession began. And in first century Judea, a funeral procession was never a private affair. It moved through the streets, or along the road out of the city, with the whole community watching, joining, mourning openly. The body was carried on a wooden bier, a flat, stretcher-like frame covered in cloth. No coffins, no sealed boxes, just the wrapped body, resting in the open air, carried on the shoulders of men, usually the closest male relatives. They walked slowly, in near silence, or accompanied by the low, mournful sound of flutes and the rhythmic cries of the mourners behind them. The Gospels describe this scene with the familiarity of something every reader in that world would have recognized immediately. Near the town of Nain, a widow walks behind a bier carrying her only son. The procession moves through the gate. The crowd follows. No explanation is needed in the text, because everyone reading it knew exactly what that looked like. There was a specific road, sometimes called the Road of the Dead, that led away from the city toward the burial grounds carved into the hillside. To walk that road was to cross a threshold. between the world of the living and the world of the waiting. The tombs carved in rock. The tombs themselves were remarkable structures, and they were everywhere around Jerusalem. Cut directly into the soft limestone hillsides, they were not holes in the ground. They were rooms, carved rooms, sometimes with multiple chambers branching from a central space. You entered through a low doorway, often crouching, sometimes nearly crawling, and inside the rock opened up into a cool, dim chamber. Along the walls, horizontal niches had been carved, narrow tunnels just wide enough to slide a body into, feet first. Archaeologists call them kokim. In the 1st century, the people who used them simply called them home. The entrance was sealed with a large stone, sometimes a flat slab, sometimes a great circular disc that rolled in a groove cut into the rock floor. These rolling stones were not common for ordinary families, but archaeology has confirmed they existed, and that they were used by those who could afford the craftsmanship. Inside the tomb, the smell of earth and cut stone and dried spice. The torchlight would catch the edges of the niches. Shadows shifted. The compression of the space, grief packed into limestone, was absolute. But this was not a final resting place. It was a first one. The real burial was still to come. Ossuaries and family burials. After about a year, once the body had fully decomposed, the family would return to the tomb. They would open the entrance stone, step inside the cool darkness, and with deliberate, careful hands, they would gather the bones of their loved one and place them into a small limestone box, an ossuary. These stone boxes, roughly the length of a femur, were sometimes plain, sometimes decorated with carved rosettes, geometric patterns, or inscriptions naming the dead. Thousands of them have been recovered from the hills around Jerusalem. Some bear names that echo through the pages of the New Testament: Joseph, Miriam, Yeshua, Salome. The act had a name in Hebrew, Likut Atzamot, the gathering of bones. It was a second mourning, a moment when grief, already lived through once, was lived through again in miniature, holding what remained of a person in both hands. The ossuary would then be moved into a side chamber of the family tomb, stacked alongside the ossuaries of grandparents, parents, children, generation layered upon generation in the same carved room. The family tomb was not just a grave, it was a house that held in stone the accumulated weight of every person a family had ever been, and to be gathered into it was to be gathered back into something larger than yourself. What the cemetery said about eternity. Not everyone was buried the same way. The rock-cut tombs with their carved niches, their rolling stones, their decorated ossuaries, those belonged to families who could afford them. Wealthy families in Jerusalem invested considerably in their burial chambers. Some commissioned monumental facades carved directly into the hillside, visible from the road. Columns, cornices, inscriptions in Greek and Hebrew proclaiming the family name to anyone who passed. But the poor were buried differently, in simple trenches cut into the earth, without spices, without ossuaries, without the ceremony of return. Some were buried in communal fields, places set aside for those with no family, no means, no name to be preserved in stone. Even in death, the social order did not disappear. The cemetery was a map of the city it surrounded, and yet, underneath all of it, something quietly equal. In 1st century Jewish thought, the body mattered. It was not discarded. It was not simply returned to the earth and forgotten. It was gathered, kept, stored with care. Because for many, perhaps most, what lay in those niches and those plain limestone boxes was not finished. It was waiting. The cemetery was not a place of ending. It was a place of unresolved questions, and the silence it held, that dry, wind-swept silence outside the city walls, was the silence of something that had not yet been answered.